To understand the Roman Empire, you must first understand the man who built it, the man we now know as Augustus. And to understand him, you have to understand that he was, in almost every way, the polar opposite of his famous great-uncle, Julius Caesar. Caesar was all flash, charisma, and reckless brilliance. He was a military genius who inspired fanatical devotion in his soldiers, a populist who charmed the masses, and a man whose ambition was so vast and so obvious that it ultimately got him stabbed to death on the floor of the Senate. Octavian, his young heir, learned a crucial lesson from Caesar's murder. Raw, overt power frightens Romans, especially the rich and influential ones. It reminded them of the hated kings of their distant past. The trick was not to seize power, but to have it given to you, almost reluctantly. Octavian was not a great general. In battle, he was often physically ill, and his military victories were almost always won by his brilliant right-hand man, Marcus Agrippa. He was not a charismatic orator who could sway a crowd with a single speech. His power lay in something far less dramatic, but far more enduring. A bottomless capacity for patience, a preternatural gift for administration, and a cold, calculating understanding of political theater. He was, at his core, a committee man, an administrator, a political operator of unparalleled skill. He knew that after decades of chaos and bloodshed, the Roman people, and especially the Senate, were not craving another brilliant, unpredictable genius. They were craving peace, stability, and a return to the old ways. And so Octavian decided to give them exactly that, or at least the illusion of it. He understood that you could change the substance of power completely, as long as you meticulously preserved the familiar forms. He would not be a king. He would not be a dictator. He would be the quiet, humble servant of the state, the man who, having saved the republic, was now dutifully returning power to its rightful owners. It was the greatest political performance in history, a long-running show that would last for over 40 years, and by the time it was over, no one could remember what the republic had even looked like. He was the ultimate iron fist, hidden inside the softest of velvet gloves.
The stage for this grand performance was set in 27 BC. After years of consolidating his power, eliminating his rivals, and securing the loyalty of the legions, Octavian made his masterstroke. He walked into the Roman Senate and, in a carefully prepared speech, announced that he was relinquishing all of his extraordinary powers. He was, he declared, restoring the republic. He was giving control back to the Senate and the people of Rome. The civil wars were over. Peace was restored, and his job was done. You can imagine the scene. The senators, many of whom owed their careers and their lives to him, were likely a mixture of shocked, terrified, and deeply suspicious. They knew that without Octavian and his control over the army, the state would immediately collapse back into civil war. So they did exactly what he knew they would do. They begged him to stay. They protested. They implored him to remain as the guardian of the state. After a great show of reluctance, Octavian humbly agreed to accept a portion of the power back. He wouldn't be dictator, of course, but he would accept control over a few key provinces, the ones on the frontier where all the legions were stationed. A purely practical measure, you understand, to ensure the borders were safe. He would also accept a new title, one that had no real legal power, but was rich with moral authority: Augustus, the revered or illustrious one. And just like that, the deal was done. He had officially given all power back to the Senate, while in reality keeping the single most important source of power, the army, in his own hands. He maintained the illusion of the republic. The Senate still met, elections were still held, magistrates were still appointed, but everyone knew who was really in charge. He didn't call himself emperor. He preferred the simple title of princeps, or first citizen. It was a brilliant piece of political branding. He wasn't a master. He was just the most important man in the room, the first among equals, who just so happened to control every legion in the empire. It was a lie, of course, a beautiful and effective lie that everyone tacitly agreed to believe in because the alternative was more war.
With his political position secure, Augustus embarked on the colossal task of rebuilding the Roman world, which had been shattered by nearly a century of internal conflict. His long reign was, for the most part, a period of peace and profound administrative reform. He was not an innovator in the vein of Caesar. He was a restorer, a consolidator. His genius was in creating the systems and institutions that would allow the empire to function smoothly for the next 2 centuries. He was, in essence, the first and greatest CEO of Rome, Inc. He started with the army. He professionalized it, turning it from a collection of private armies loyal to individual generals into a standing, state-funded military loyal to the emperor alone. He established a treasury to pay the soldiers and a pension plan for veterans, ensuring their loyalty and preventing them from becoming a destabilizing force. He then turned to the provinces, the vast territories that had been so ruthlessly exploited by Republican governors. He created a professional civil service, paid regular salaries, and put systems in place to ensure that taxes were collected fairly and that governors were held accountable. For the average person living in Gaul or Syria, the arrival of the empire was not an oppression, but a relief. It meant peace, stability, and a predictable system of law. In Rome itself, his impact was monumental. He famously boasted that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. He oversaw a massive public building program, constructing new temples, theaters, aqueducts, and public baths. He established the city's first fire brigade and a rudimentary police force, the Vigils. He reformed the currency, he built new roads to connect the empire, and he established the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a period of unprecedented stability that allowed commerce and culture to flourish. He was, in essence, a tireless, obsessive administrator, a man who understood that an empire is not held together by glorious victories, but by good roads, a stable currency, and a functioning tax system.
While Augustus was a master of public administration, his private, domestic life was a source of constant anxiety and disappointment. The man who could effortlessly manage a global empire found himself utterly incapable of managing his own family and securing a smooth succession. This became the great tragic irony of his long reign. His entire political settlement was designed to provide stability, but his own bloodline seemed cursed with instability and premature death. He needed a male heir, a son to whom he could pass the unique and undeclared powers he had accumulated. But he had no sons of his own. His only biological child was his daughter, Julia. His hopes, therefore, rested on finding a suitable husband for her and adopting their son as his own. His first choice was his nephew, Marcellus, a promising young man whom he adored. But Marcellus died suddenly of a fever, plunging Augustus into grief. His next choice was his loyal general and right-hand man, the formidable Marcus Agrippa. He forced the middle-aged Agrippa to divorce his wife and marry the much younger Julia. This union produced 2 grandsons, Gaius and Lucius Caesar, and for a time it seemed the succession was secure. Augustus adopted them both as his sons and began to groom them for power. But fate once again intervened. Both Gaius and Lucius died young, one of an illness, the other from a battle wound, before they could inherit. Throughout all of this, there was one constant, powerful figure at his side, his wife, Livia. She was a shrewd, intelligent, and ambitious woman who had 2 sons of her own from a previous marriage, Tiberius and Drusus. While Augustus was fixated on his own bloodline, Livia was patiently maneuvering her own sons into positions of power. The ancient historians, particularly Tacitus, paint a sinister picture of Livia, hinting that she may have had a hand in the convenient deaths of Augustus's other heirs, clearing the path for her own son, Tiberius. While likely just a malicious rumor, it speaks to the atmosphere of paranoia and suspicion that haunted the imperial family. The man who had brought peace to the world could find none in his own home.
The greatest source of Augustus's domestic pain was his daughter, Julia. Raised to be a pawn in her father's dynastic plans, married off 3 times for political reasons, Julia eventually decided to live a life of her own, a life that was a direct and public repudiation of everything her father publicly stood for. While Augustus was passing strict moral legislation, promoting family values and punishing adultery, his own daughter was secretly engaged in a whirlwind of scandalous affairs with some of the most prominent men in Rome. For years, Augustus was apparently oblivious, but in 2 BC, the scandal finally broke, and it broke in the most public and humiliating way possible. The details of Julia's debauchery became the talk of the town. There were stories of late-night drinking parties in the Roman Forum itself, of her flitting from one lover to another, and of her generally flouting every moral law her father had so piously enacted. For Augustus, the intensely private and image-conscious emperor, this was an unbearable personal and political catastrophe. His own daughter had made a mockery of his entire moral platform. His reaction was swift and merciless. He had her arrested, and he sent a letter to the Senate publicly denouncing her for treason and adultery, listing all of her alleged lovers by name. Many of her lovers were executed or exiled. As for Julia, as her father, he could not bring himself to execute her, but as the paterfamilias and the guardian of Roman morality, he could not forgive her. He chose a punishment that was, for a social creature like Julia, a living death. He exiled her to Pandateria, a tiny, barren, and treeless island in the Mediterranean. She was forbidden from drinking wine and from having any male visitors without his express permission. He never saw her again, and was said to have bitterly quoted a line from the Iliad, saying, "Would that I had never married and had died childless."
After decades of rule, after outliving all his rivals, his friends, and all his chosen heirs, Augustus in his old age became a lonely, almost mythical figure. He had ruled for so long that very few people could even remember a time before him. The Republic was a distant, abstract concept. The Principate was the only reality they knew. He had succeeded so completely that he had made himself indispensable. With all his grandsons dead, he was finally forced, with deep reluctance, to turn to the last available option as his heir, his stepson, Tiberius. Tiberius was a capable general, but a gloomy, misanthropic, and deeply awkward man whom Augustus personally disliked. But he was all that was left. Augustus adopted him, shared his imperial powers, and prepared the state for its first ever succession. In the summer of 14 AD, at the age of 75, Augustus's health finally began to fail. Feeling the end was near, he traveled to the town of Nola in Campania, to the very house where his own father had died. Surrounded by his wife Livia and his chosen heir Tiberius, he faced his own death with the same pragmatic calm with which he had lived his life. He called for a mirror, had his hair combed, and his jaw, which had dropped with age, set straight. Then he turned to the friends gathered round his bed and asked them a question, as if he were an actor at the end of a play. Acta est fabula, plaudite? The play is over, applaud? Or, by another account, have I played the part well? Then applaud as I exit. With these final, self-aware words, the architect of the Roman Empire died. His reign of 41 years had been so long, so transformative, that it remains one of the most significant in all of human history. He had found Rome in chaos and left it in peace. He had invented a new form of government, but he had also created a system where the fate of the entire world now depended on the character of just one man. And the man who was to follow him was a very different character indeed.
The death of Augustus created a problem no one in Rome had ever faced before: a job vacancy for the position of God Emperor in all but name. The system Augustus had built was so personal, so tied to his own authority, that its continuation was not guaranteed. All eyes turned to his chosen heir, the 55-year-old Tiberius. And Tiberius, in a masterclass of political awkwardness, seemed to want nothing to do with it. When the Senate gathered to officially bestow upon him the powers of Augustus, he played coy. He complained that he was too old, that the empire was too vast for one man to manage, and he suggested that perhaps the power should be shared. The senators, who knew this was a test, fell over themselves begging him to accept. They wept, they pleaded, they prostrated themselves. They knew that the alternative to Tiberius was another civil war, and they were desperate to avoid it. After a long, cringe-inducing performance of reluctance, Tiberius finally, grudgingly, accepted. This set the tone for his entire reign. Tiberius was, by all accounts, a capable administrator and a fine general, but he was also a deeply gloomy, suspicious, and resentful man. He had spent most of his life being passed over by Augustus in favor of younger, more charismatic heirs, all of whom had died. He was the last choice, the leftover, and he knew it. He hated the hypocrisy and flattery of the Senate, and he made no effort to hide his contempt. While Augustus had masterfully played the part of the humble first citizen, Tiberius couldn't be bothered. He was a sour, private man who was now trapped in the most public job in the world, and his misery would soon become the misery of the entire Roman elite. The first transfer of imperial power had succeeded, but it installed a man on the throne who seemed to hate his own authority and everyone around him.
One of the most insidious developments under Tiberius was the rise of the treason trial, or Maestas trial. The law against diminishing the majesty of the Roman people was an old one, but under Tiberius it was twisted into a political weapon. It became a tool for ambitious informers, known as delatores, to get rich, and for the emperor to eliminate his perceived enemies. The law was so vaguely defined that almost anything could be interpreted as treason. Had you criticized a statue of the emperor? Treason. Had you told a disrespectful joke about him at a dinner party? Treason. Had you taken a coin bearing his image into a brothel? Treason. A network of professional informers sprang up, eager to exploit this new climate of fear. If a person was successfully convicted of treason, their property was confiscated by the state, and the informer who had brought the case received a substantial cut, often as much as a quarter of the deceased's estate. This created a horrifying incentive for people to fabricate charges against their wealthy neighbors. The city of Rome became gripped by a quiet, creeping paranoia. No one knew who they could trust. A stray word to a friend, a disgruntled slave, a political rival, any of them could report you. The Senate, eager to prove its loyalty to the suspicious emperor, became a kangaroo court, rubber-stamping convictions with very little evidence. Tiberius himself seemed to encourage this, at least at first. It was a way to fill the state's coffers and to keep the ambitious aristocracy in a state of perpetual fear. But this atmosphere of suspicion and terror, which he had fostered, would eventually be turned against him by the most ambitious man in the empire, a man who was, for a time, his closest and only friend, Lucius Aelius Sejanus, the prefect of the Praetorian Guard.
In 26 AD, Tiberius did something unprecedented. Hating Rome and its fawning senators, he abandoned the city and retired to the island of Capri, off the coast of Naples. He would never return to the capital and would rule the entire Roman Empire from his secluded island villa for the last 11 years of his life. Back in Rome, he left one man in charge, Sejanus. Sejanus was the commander of the Praetorian Guard, the elite military unit that served as the emperor's bodyguard. He was cunning, ruthless, and deeply ambitious. With Tiberius gone, Sejanus became the most powerful man in Rome. He controlled access to the emperor, he commanded the only troops in the city, and he used the treason laws to systematically eliminate his rivals. For years, Sejanus was untouchable. He was the emperor's trusted partner. But his ambition was limitless. He began to plot his own path to the throne, even seeking to marry into the imperial family. From his island retreat, however, the paranoid Tiberius began to grow suspicious of his powerful prefect. He received a secret warning from his sister-in-law, Antonia, detailing Sejanus's conspiracy. Tiberius's response was a masterstroke of political cunning and cruelty. He sent a long, rambling letter to the Senate, which was read aloud. The letter began by praising Sejanus, then drifted to other topics, then made a few minor criticisms of him, then praised him again. The senators and Sejanus himself, who was present, were completely bewildered. They had no idea if the letter was meant to honor him or condemn him. Only in the final lines did the letter's true purpose become clear. It accused Sejanus of treason and ordered his immediate arrest. The senators, seeing their chance, immediately turned on the man they had feared for so long. Sejanus was seized, executed, and his body was torn to pieces by the Roman mob. A brutal purge of his family and supporters followed. The affair revealed the true nature of Tiberius's rule, a remote, paranoid puppet master pulling the strings of terror from his island fortress.
When Tiberius finally died of old age, the relief in Rome was immense. The city celebrated, and all hopes turned to his chosen successor, the young, charismatic son of the beloved general Germanicus. His real name was Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, but everyone knew him by his childhood nickname, Caligula, which meant little boot, a name given to him by the soldiers his father had commanded. Caligula's accession in 37 AD was met with universal joy. He was young, handsome, and popular. He began his reign by issuing bonuses to the Praetorian Guard, ending the treason trials, and throwing lavish public games. It seemed as though the gloomy, paranoid night of Tiberius's reign was over, and a new golden dawn had arrived. But this hopeful beginning lasted only a few months. Late in his first year as emperor, Caligula fell gravely ill with what was described as a brain fever. He was delirious for weeks, and the entire empire prayed for his recovery. He did recover, but according to our sources, the man who emerged was not the same charming young man who had fallen ill. He was a monster. The illness seemed to have broken something in his mind, unleashing a torrent of cruelty, megalomania, and bizarre absolute tyranny. The promising young emperor had, it seemed, gone completely insane. Whether he was truly clinically insane, or whether the experience of absolute, unquestioned power simply corrupted him absolutely, is impossible to know. What is certain is that the next 3 years of his reign became a legendary chapter in Roman imperial excess. He began a new wave of treason trials, far more arbitrary and brutal than those under Tiberius, using them to execute wealthy senators and confiscate their estates to fund his lavish lifestyle. He was said to have indulged in wild orgies, to have had incestuous relationships with his sisters, and to have treated the lives of those around him with a casual, godlike contempt.
The stories of Caligula's reign are so strange, so theatrical, that they have become the stuff of legend. It is often difficult to separate historical fact from the slander written by his enemies after his death. But the tales themselves paint a vivid picture of a man unhinged by power. The most famous of these stories, of course, concerns his beloved horse, Incitatus. Caligula was said to have doted on the animal,
providing it with a marble stable, an ivory manger, and a retinue of slaves. The story culminates in his supposed plan to make the horse a consul, the highest political office in Rome. As we've discussed before, this was likely not a sign of madness, but a calculated, deeply sarcastic insult to a Senate he despised, a way of showing them that his horse was just as competent as any of them. Another famous tale is of his planned invasion of Britain. He marched the legions to the northern coast of Gaul, and then, instead of crossing the Channel, he ordered his soldiers to attack the ocean and to gather seashells as the spoils of their victory over the god Neptune. This was portrayed as another act of insanity, but it may have been a bizarre, humiliating punishment for legions that had shown signs of mutiny. With Caligula, the line between madness and a kind of dark theatrical performance art is impossibly blurry. His megalomania certainly grew. He began to demand that he be worshipped as a living god, a deus praesens. He built temples to himself and even had the heads of famous statues of gods like Jupiter replaced with replicas of his own head. He would appear in public dressed as Hercules or Venus or Apollo. For the conservative Roman aristocracy, this was the ultimate transgression, a terrifying blend of absolute power and sacrilegious madness. It became clear to those around him that the little boot who had become a monster could not be allowed to rule for much longer.
By 41 AD, after less than 4 years of his bizarre and terrifying rule, the breaking point had been reached. A conspiracy was formed against Caligula, not by ambitious senators, but by the very men who were supposed to protect him, the officers of the Praetorian Guard. The leader of the conspiracy was Cassius Chaerea, a tribune of the guard whom Caligula had constantly mocked and insulted, calling him soft and effeminate. Chaerea, a proud soldier, decided to have his revenge. The assassins chose their moment carefully. During a series of games held at the Palatine Hill, as Caligula was walking through a private, covered corridor on his way to his palace, the conspirators struck. Chaerea approached the emperor and asked him for the day's password. When Caligula gave him another insulting, effeminate password, Chaerea uttered the famous line, "Acciperatum," or "take this," and struck the first blow. The other guards then swarmed in, stabbing the emperor over and over again. In their fury, they did not stop with him. They rushed to the palace and murdered his wife, Caesonia, and even his infant daughter, Julia Drusilla, who they are said to have killed by swinging her against a wall. They were determined to extinguish Caligula's entire line. The assassination threw the city into chaos. The Senate, seeing an opportunity, began to dream of restoring the Republic, of ending the experiment of one-man rule for good. But they had forgotten about the Praetorian Guard. The guards had no desire to return to the Republic, an institution that would see them lose their privileged status and power. They had just killed one emperor, and now they needed to find another one, fast, to legitimize their actions and secure their position. And as one of their soldiers was looting the palace, he happened to look behind a curtain. And there, cowering in fear, was Caligula's uncle, a 50-year-old man named Claudius.
The accession of Claudius is one of the strangest and most comical stories in all of Roman history. While the Senate was busy debating the restoration of liberty, the Praetorian Guard was taking matters into their own hands. A common soldier, wandering through the now eerily quiet imperial palace, noticed a pair of feet sticking out from under a large curtain. Curious, he pulled the curtain back and found a man trembling in fear. It was Tiberius Claudius Drusus, the 50-year-old uncle of the murdered Caligula. Claudius, assuming the guard was there to kill him too, fell to the floor and begged for his life. Claudius had been the butt of the family's jokes his entire life. He was afflicted with a limp, a slight deafness, and a nervous stammer.
His own mother called him a monstrosity, a man whom nature had begun but not finished. The imperial family had considered him a dull-witted embarrassment and had kept him out of public life. But the soldier, instead of killing him, recognized him, and in a moment of inspiration, he and his fellow guards realized this was their solution. Here was a member of the imperial family, a son of the beloved General Drusus, a direct link to Augustus. They hailed him as the new emperor on the spot. They carried the terrified and bewildered Claudius on their shoulders to the Praetorian camp. The Senate, realizing they had no army to back up their lofty republican ideals, were forced to capitulate. They reluctantly confirmed the Praetorians' choice. And so, Claudius, the scholar, the stammerer, the man everyone had dismissed as a fool, became the fourth Roman emperor. He had come to power not through ambition or conspiracy, but by being in the right place, at the right time, cowering behind the right curtain. It was a thoroughly absurd beginning to what would turn out to be a surprisingly effective reign.
Everyone in Rome expected Claudius's reign to be a disaster. They saw him as a weak, bumbling fool who would be a puppet of the Praetorian Guard. But Claudius, once in power, proved everyone wrong. He had spent his life ostracized from public affairs and had dedicated his time to study, becoming a respected, if obscure, historian. He was far more intelligent and capable than anyone, including his own family, had ever given him credit for. He began his reign by executing the lead assassins of Caligula, showing that he would not be controlled by the men who had put him in power. He then set about governing with a surprising and almost pedantic attention to detail. He was a tireless administrator. He took a keen personal interest in the legal system, often presiding over court cases himself. He launched a massive program of public works, building a new port at Ostia to secure Rome's grain supply, as well as new aqueducts and roads. He reformed the civil service, creating a more efficient bureaucracy to manage the sprawling empire. He was also, unexpectedly, an expansionist. It was under his reign that the Romans finally launched a full-scale and successful invasion of a land that had even defied Julius Caesar, the mysterious island of Britain. In 43 AD, Claudius sent 4 legions to conquer Britain. He himself even traveled to the island for a short time to witness the final victory, celebrating a grand triumph in Rome for a conquest that had eluded his more celebrated predecessors. He proved to be a far more effective emperor than the handsome Caligula or the gloomy Tiberius. But his reign had a significant weakness. Because he had been excluded by the senatorial class his whole life, he did not trust them. Instead, he relied heavily on a small group of advisors drawn from a source that scandalized the old aristocracy, his own trusted Greek freedmen.
The traditional Roman elite was horrified by Claudius's style of government. He largely ignored the Senate and instead ran the empire through a cabinet of his own former slaves, his Greek freedmen. These men, such as Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus, became the most powerful figures in the empire after the emperor himself. They were intelligent, efficient, and ruthlessly ambitious, and they controlled all access to the emperor, managed the state's finances, and drafted most of the imperial legislation. For a senator to get anything done, he first had to humble himself before a man he legally considered to be subhuman. This earned Claudius the permanent enmity of the aristocracy, who portrayed him in their histories as a doddering old fool being manipulated by his conniving servants. But the greatest scandals of his reign came not from his freedmen, but from his wives. Claudius had a disastrous taste in women. His third wife, the young and beautiful Valeria Messalina, was infamous for her scandalous behavior. The stories told about her are legendary. She was said to be a nymphomaniac who would sneak out of the palace at night to work in a brothel,
and who used her influence over the aging Claudius to have her personal and political rivals executed. The affair came to a head in 48 AD while Claudius was away from Rome. Messalina, in an act of unbelievable audacity, formally divorced the emperor and married her current lover, a handsome senator named Gaius Silius. This was not just an affair, it was an open act of treason. When the freedman Narcissus informed Claudius of the plot, the emperor was paralyzed with indecision. It was Narcissus who had to take charge, ordering the Praetorian Guard to execute Messalina and her new husband without waiting for the emperor's direct command. Claudius's reign was effective, but his household was a chaotic mess of intrigue and scandal.
After the Messalina debacle, the now 60-year-old Claudius needed a new wife. His freedmen advisors each proposed a candidate, but Claudius ultimately chose the one with the most dangerous ambition of all, his own niece, Agrippina the Younger. Agrippina was the sister of the dead emperor Caligula, and she was a woman who had inherited all of her family's ruthless ambition. She had one goal in life: to see her own son from a previous marriage placed on the imperial throne. Her son was a young boy named Lucius Domitius Ionobarb, but the world would come to know him by the name he took after his adoption, Nero. Agrippina was a masterful political operator. Once married to Claudius, she moved quickly to consolidate her power. She had her rival, Lolia Paulina, exiled and executed. She convinced Claudius to formally adopt her son Nero, making him the stepbrother of Claudius's own biological son, Britannicus. She then systematically promoted her own supporters and had her enemies, particularly those loyal to the memory of Messalina and her son Britannicus, removed from power. She even managed to have the philosopher Seneca recalled from exile to become Nero's personal tutor, ensuring her son had a prestigious education. By 54 AD, her plans were complete. Nero was now 17, a handsome and popular young man, while the rightful heir, Britannicus, was still a young boy. Agrippina knew that the aging Claudius might still change his mind in favor of his own son. So, according to the ancient historians, she decided to act. She allegedly served Claudius his favorite dish, a plate of mushrooms, but one of them had been laced with a deadly poison. The old emperor died in agony, and before anyone could rally around Britannicus, Agrippina presented her son Nero to the Praetorian Guard, who hailed him as the new emperor. Agrippina's long and patient conspiracy had succeeded. Her son was now the master of the world.
The reign of Nero, the last of the Julio-Claudian emperors, began with incredible promise. For the first 5 years, from 54 to 59 AD, the Roman Empire was, by all accounts, governed extremely well. This period is known as the Quinquennium Neronis, and it was remembered by later generations as a mini golden age. The reason for the success was that the young Nero, who was more interested in music, poetry, and chariot racing than in the tedious business of administration, left the governing to 3 very capable advisors. The first was his mother, Agrippina, who for a time acted as the true power behind the throne. The second was his tutor, the great Stoic philosopher, Lucius Annaeus Seneca. And the third was the pragmatic and honest prefect of the Praetorian Guard, Sextus Afronius Burrus. Together, this trio ran the empire with moderation and efficiency. They worked well with the Senate, they reformed the tax system, and they managed the provinces justly. The early years of Nero's reign were a period of peace and stability. But this balance of power could not last. Nero grew older and began to resent the overbearing influence of his mother. Agrippina was a woman who did not know how to let go of power, and she increasingly clashed with her son as he tried to assert his own authority. At the same time, Nero fell under the influence of new, less savory friends, like the ambitious new Praetorian prefect, Tigellinus, who encouraged his worst impulses. The turning point came in 59 AD. Frustrated with his mother's constant interference, and perhaps encouraged by his new mistress, Poppaea Sabina, Nero made a terrible decision. He decided that his own mother had to die.
The murder of one's own mother was a crime of almost unimaginable horror to the Romans, and the story of how Nero accomplished it is a black comedy of incompetence and terror. According to the historian Tacitus, Nero first tried to poison his mother several times, but Agrippina, ever the connoisseur of court intrigue, had built up an immunity by taking small doses of poison herself. Next, Nero arranged for a machine to be installed in the ceiling above her bed, designed to drop heavy lead weights on her while she slept. This plan also failed. His most elaborate attempt was a specially designed collapsible boat. He invited Agrippina to a pleasant seaside dinner party at Baiae and then sent her home on this trick boat, which was designed to fall apart in the middle of the bay. The boat did collapse, but Agrippina, a strong swimmer, managed to survive and swim to shore, where she was rescued. She now knew without a doubt that her son was trying to kill her. She sent a messenger to Nero, calmly informing him that she had survived the accident. Nero, now in a complete panic that his mother would expose him, decided to abandon all subtlety. He sent a group of assassins to her villa. They surrounded her bed, and as they raised their swords, Agrippina is said to have coolly pointed to her own womb and said, "Strike here," a final bitter reference to the son she had brought into the world. They killed her. The matricide was complete. With this act, Nero had crossed a moral Rubicon. The influence of Seneca and Burrus waned, the good years were over, and the true tyrannical nature of Nero's reign was about to begin. The artist who fancied himself a god was now a murderer, and his reign would descend into a spiral of paranoia, persecution, and spectacle.
With his mother out of the way, Nero's true personality came to the fore. He fully embraced his artistic pretensions, scandalizing the Roman aristocracy by performing publicly on stage, singing his own poetry and playing the lyre, activities considered utterly undignified for an emperor. He also developed a taste for immense, self-indulgent building projects. And in 64 AD, an event occurred that would give him the opportunity to build on the grandest possible scale: the Great Fire of Rome. The fire began in the shops around the Circus Maximus and raged for over a week, destroying vast swaths of the city. The ancient historians, writing decades later, were quick to blame Nero. The most famous story, of course, is that Nero fiddled while Rome burned, watching the inferno from a tower while composing a song about the fall of Troy. This is almost certainly a slanderous myth. The fiddle had not yet been invented, and the historian Tacitus, who was a child in Rome at the time, reports that Nero was not even in the city when the fire started. He rushed back and organized the relief efforts, opening his own palaces to the homeless. But the reason the rumor stuck was because of what Nero did next. On the vast, cleared land in the center of the city that had been destroyed by the fire, he began construction of his new palace, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. It was a colossal, decadent villa complex with an artificial lake, revolving dining rooms, and a 120-foot-tall bronze statue of himself. To the suffering Roman people, it looked as though Nero had burned down their city just to build his personal playground. To deflect this anger, Nero needed a scapegoat, and he found one in a small, obscure, and widely distrusted religious sect, the Christians. He initiated the first major persecution of the Christians, blaming them for the fire and subjecting them to horrific public tortures, turning the victims of a tragedy into the perpetrators of a crime to cover his own perceived guilt. Nero's tyranny and extravagance could not last. A major conspiracy against him, led by a senator named Gaius Calpurnius Piso, was uncovered in 65 AD. The conspiracy involved many prominent senators, equestrians, and even his old tutor, Seneca. Nero's revenge was swift and brutal. The conspirators were forced to commit suicide, including Seneca, who met his end with stoic calm. This was followed by a new reign of terror, as Nero, now deeply paranoid, saw enemies everywhere. He executed anyone he remotely suspected of disloyalty. His behavior grew more erratic. He kicked his pregnant wife Poppaea to death in a fit of rage, and then, bizarrely, married a young boy whom he had castrated to look like her. By 68 AD, the empire had had enough. The governor of Gaul, Gaius Julius Vindex, openly rebelled against Nero. He was soon supported by the governor of Spain, Servius Sulpicius Galba. Although Vindex's rebellion was crushed, the tide had turned. The legions in Spain declared Galba emperor. The Praetorian Guard back in Rome, sensing which way the wind was blowing, abandoned Nero and declared their support for Galba as well. The Senate, now free from their fear, declared Nero a public enemy, meaning anyone could kill him without punishment. The emperor found himself completely alone, abandoned by all but a few of his loyal freedmen. He fled the palace and hid in a villa outside the city. As he heard the sound of horsemen approaching to arrest him, he knew the end had come. Unable to summon the courage to kill himself, he had his secretary, Epaphroditus, help him plunge a dagger into his own throat. His famous last words, according to Suetonius, were, "Qualis artifex pereo," "What an artist dies in me." With his pathetic, ignominious death, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, which had ruled Rome for a century, was extinguished.
The death of Nero plunged the Roman world back into the one thing it feared most: civil war. Nero had left no heir, and the system Augustus had built was not designed for such a power vacuum. In the chaotic period that followed, lasting from the middle of 68 AD to the end of 69 AD, the empire saw 4 different men claim the title of emperor in rapid succession. This bloody and anarchic period is known as the Year of the 4 Emperors, and it revealed a new and terrible secret about the nature of Roman power: that an emperor could be made not just in Rome, but by the legions in the provinces. The first of the 4 was Galba, the governor of Spain who had led the revolt against Nero. He was an old, stern, and wealthy aristocrat from an ancient family. He marched to Rome and was accepted by the Senate, but he made a series of fatal mistakes. He was incredibly stingy, refusing to pay the bonuses that the Praetorian Guard and the legions expected for their support. He was also cruel and out of touch with the people. He was an old-school Republican disciplinarian in an age that required a populist touch. His downfall came quickly. One of his early supporters, a charismatic but debt-ridden nobleman named Marcus Salvius Otho, had hoped to be named Galba's heir. When Galba instead adopted a different young noble, Otho was furious. He went to the Praetorian camp, promised the guards the bonus Galba had refused them, and convinced them to overthrow the old emperor. The Praetorians marched into the forum, cornered the 73-year-old Galba, and murdered him. His brief 7-month reign was over. Otho, the man who had paid for the coup, was now the new emperor.
Otho's reign was destined to be even shorter than Galba's. While he was popular in Rome, he had a major problem. Before Galba's death, the powerful legions stationed on the Rhine frontier in Germania had grown tired of his rule, and had already proclaimed their own commander, Aulus Vitellius, as emperor. When they heard that Galba was dead and Otho had taken his place, they didn't care. They considered Otho an illegitimate usurper, and they began their march on Italy.
Otho was now forced to fight a civil war against a battle-hardened and superior military force. Otho marched his own legions north to meet Vitellius's army. The two forces clashed at the First Battle of Bedriacum in northern Italy. Otho's army was decisively defeated. When Otho heard the news of the defeat, he made a surprising decision. Instead of retreating and continuing the war, a move which would have plunged Italy into a long and destructive conflict, he decided to end it. He told his remaining soldiers that he would rather sacrifice his own life than be responsible for more Roman bloodshed. That night, after speaking with his friends and ensuring his family's safety, he committed suicide. He had ruled for just 3 months. His opponent, Vitellius, was now the undisputed emperor. He marched to Rome and was recognized by the Senate. Vitellius was known primarily for one thing: his love of luxury and food. He was a notorious glutton, and his brief reign was marked by a series of extravagant and incredibly expensive banquets. But while he was feasting in Rome, another challenger was already rising. The powerful legions in the eastern provinces of Judea and Syria had decided they didn't like Vitellius either, and they had proclaimed their own commander as emperor, a practical, no-nonsense general named Titus Flavius Vespasianus, or Vespasian. The civil war was not over yet. The legions of the east had been victorious. The gluttonous Vitellius was dead, dragged through the streets of Rome and unceremoniously dumped into the Tiber. The civil war was finally over. The new master of the Roman world was the man the eastern legions had proclaimed, Titus Flavius Vespasianus. Vespasian was, in every conceivable way, a complete departure from the emperors who had come before. He was not a member of the ancient, blue-blooded Julio-Claudian aristocracy. He came from a humble equestrian class family of tax collectors and soldiers from the Italian countryside. He was 60 years old, bald, and possessed a famously plain, craggy face. He was a professional soldier, a man who had worked his way up the ranks through competence and grit, not through inheritance. And he had a sense of humor. He was known for his dry, earthy wit and his complete lack of pretension. When he first became emperor, he was said to have joked about the elaborate and often fabricated genealogies that previous emperors had created to link themselves to gods and heroes. He was, in short, a breath of fresh, unpretentious air after the madness of Nero and the chaos of the Civil War. But he inherited an empire on the brink of collapse. The treasury was empty, the city of Rome was damaged from the street fighting, and the legitimacy of the emperor's office was in tatters. Vespasian's main task was to restore stability, and he tackled it with the common-sense pragmatism of a provincial accountant. His first priority was money. The lavish spending of Nero in the Civil War had bankrupted the state. Vespasian initiated a series of new taxes to refill the treasury. Some were unpopular, but he pursued them with a relentless, unapologetic focus on the bottom line. The most famous of these was his tax on the public urinals of Rome. When his own son, Titus, complained that this was a disgusting and undignified way to raise money, Vespasian is said to have held a gold coin under his son's nose and asked him if it smelled. When Titus said no, Vespasian replied, "Atqui ex lotio est," and yet it comes from urine. The story perfectly encapsulates his governing philosophy. Money has no smell, and the stability of the empire is more important than anyone's delicate sensibilities. He understood the principle that stability depends on fiscal responsibility, and he wasn't afraid to make tough choices.
With the finances stabilized, Vespasian turned his attention to the city of Rome itself and to restoring the morale of its people. He knew that after the tyranny and self-indulgence of Nero, he needed to make a grand public gesture. He needed to give something back to the Roman people, and he found the perfect place to do it. He drained the massive artificial lake that had been the centerpiece of Nero's extravagant golden house and on that very spot, he began construction of a new massive amphitheater, a place of entertainment for the people, built on the footprint of a tyrant's private luxury. We know it today as the Colosseum, but its official name was the Flavian Amphitheater, a permanent monument to the new dynasty. Vespasian was a builder. He repaired the Capitol, which had been burned down during the fighting with Vitellius's forces. He built a new forum, the Forum of Peace, and a grand temple of peace to celebrate the end of the civil wars. He projected an image of himself not as a divine autocrat, but as a restorer, a man cleaning up the mess left by his predecessors. He also understood the importance of securing his own dynasty. Unlike Augustus, who had struggled for decades with the problem of succession, Vespasian made his intentions clear from day one. He had two sons, Titus and Domitian, and he was determined that they would succeed him. When a senator supposedly warned him that a conspiracy was afoot, Vespasian famously replied, "Either my sons will succeed me, or no one will." He ruled for 10 years, a decade of peace, stability, and sensible administration. He died of natural causes in 79 AD, a rare achievement for a Roman emperor. Even on his deathbed, his wit did not desert him. As he felt his life slipping away, he is said to have struggled to his feet, declaring, "Vai, poto Deus vil! Oh dear, I think I'm becoming a god." It was a final ironic jab at the custom of deifying dead emperors. With his last breath, he stood up, believing that an emperor should die on his feet. He had brought the empire back from the brink, and he left it in the capable hands of his eldest son, Titus.
The accession of Titus was smooth and celebrated. He was the first Roman emperor to directly succeed his own biological father, a testament to the stability Vespasian had created. And unlike his plain, pragmatic father, Titus was handsome, charismatic, and universally popular. He had proven himself a capable general, having been the one to finally crush the great Jewish revolt and destroy the temple in Jerusalem. Now, as emperor, he showed himself to be a generous and compassionate ruler. His short reign was so popular that the historian Suetonius would later call him amor ac delicae humani generis, the love and delight of the human race. He began his reign by halting all pending treason trials and severely punishing the informers who had thrived under previous emperors. He swore he would never put a senator to death. He was famously magnanimous, and it was said that if a day went by in which he had not done a kindness for someone, he would remark to his friends, "Friends, I have lost a day." He completed the Colosseum that his father had started and inaugurated it with a spectacular 100 days of games. He was, it seemed, the perfect emperor, a man who combined military glory with a generous spirit. But his reign, for all its promise, was defined by a series of devastating and tragic disasters. In August of 79 AD, just 2 months into his reign, Mount Vesuvius erupted, completely burying the nearby cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum in a thick blanket of ash and pumice. Titus rushed to the region of Campania to personally oversee the relief efforts, donating vast sums from the imperial treasury to aid the survivors and rebuild the region. The following year, while he was still dealing with the aftermath of the eruption, another catastrophe struck. A massive fire raged through Rome for 3 days and 3 nights, destroying many of the new buildings his father had just constructed, including the newly rebuilt Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill. And as if that were not enough, the fire was immediately followed by one of the worst outbreaks of plague the city had ever seen. Titus worked tirelessly to combat these disasters, but they seemed to be a sign that his seemingly blessed reign was in fact cursed. After just 2 years on the throne, the beloved Titus fell ill with a fever and died, leaving the empire in the hands of his younger and far more complicated brother, Domitian.
Domitian was the spare, the younger brother who had grown up in the shadow of his popular father and even more popular older brother. And this seems to have instilled in him a deep-seated insecurity and a hunger for recognition. Where Vespasian had been pragmatic and Titus had been generous, Domitian was authoritarian, suspicious, and obsessed with his own dignity. He began his reign well enough. He was a skilled and diligent administrator, perhaps even more so than his father. He governed the provinces justly, he kept the army happy, and he embarked on a massive building program in Rome, restoring the buildings damaged by the fire and constructing new grand monuments, including a magnificent new palace on the Palatine Hill. But unlike his father, he had no patience for the polite fictions of the Augustan system. He dispensed with the pretense of being the first citizen among equals. He demanded to be addressed as Dominus et Deus, Master and God. He insisted on a level of ceremony and deference that alienated the Senate. He rarely consulted them on important matters, and he treated them with open contempt. This immediately set him on a collision course with the Roman aristocracy, who saw him as a tyrant in the making. His relationship with the Senate deteriorated throughout his reign. He was a man who saw conspiracies everywhere. A failed revolt by a governor in Germania in 89 AD seems to have tipped him over into full-blown paranoia. He unleashed a new reign of terror, similar to that of Tiberius, using the treason laws to execute anyone he suspected of plotting against him. He filled the imperial treasury with the confiscated estates of the senators he had killed. He became an isolated and feared figure, ruling from his grand palace, trusting no one. The atmosphere in Rome grew dark and oppressive once more. It was clear that, like so many emperors before him, Domitian's authoritarian rule would likely end in a violent death.
By 96 AD, the fear and hatred among the Roman elite had reached a boiling point. A conspiracy was formed against the paranoid Domitian, and this time it included members of his own household and even his wife, Domitia Longina. The plotters knew they had to act decisively. They arranged for a court official to approach the emperor with a bandage on his arm, claiming he had uncovered a conspiracy and had urgent information to share. As Domitian leaned in to read the fabricated report, the official pulled a hidden dagger and stabbed him in the groin. The emperor, a strong man, fought back, but the other conspirators, including members of his own staff, rushed in and finished the job, stabbing him multiple times. The Flavian dynasty, which had begun by bringing order out of chaos, had ended, like the Julio-Claudians before it, in a bloody palace coup. With Domitian dead and his memory officially condemned by the Senate, the question of succession arose once more. This time, however, there was no civil war. The Senate, determined to avoid another military free-for-all, acted quickly. They chose one of their own, a highly respected, elderly, and most importantly, childless senator named Marcus Cocceius Nerva. Nerva was a safe choice. He was old, he was moderate, and he had no sons to start another dynasty. His appointment was a temporary stopgap measure, but Nerva, in his short reign, would make one of the most brilliant and consequential decisions in all of Roman history. He knew that his own position was weak, particularly with the army, which had been loyal to the military-minded Domitian. To secure his rule and to ensure a peaceful succession after his death, Nerva decided to formally adopt a chosen heir, not based on blood, but on merit. He chose the most powerful and respected general in the entire empire, a man named Marcus Ulpius Trajanus, or Trajan, the governor of Germania Superior. By adopting the most powerful man in the empire, Nerva guaranteed his own safety and a stable transfer of power. And in doing so, he established the principle of adoptive succession, the best man for the job, a system that would give the Roman Empire its next 80 years of peace and prosperity, an era that would later be known as the Age of the Five Good Emperors.
When Nerva died of natural causes after just 16 months in power, the succession was, for the first time in decades, peaceful and uncontested. Trajan, his adopted son, became emperor in 98 AD. Trajan was, in many ways, the embodiment of the Roman ideal. He was from a prominent family in Spain, making him the first Roman emperor to be born outside of Italy, a sign of the empire's increasingly cosmopolitan nature. He was a career soldier, a tall, imposing, and respected general who had spent most of his life on the frontiers with his troops. He was beloved by the army, but he was also a skilled administrator who treated the Senate with respect and courtesy. He was the perfect synthesis of military strength and civilian dignity. His reign is best remembered for two things: military expansion and public works. Trajan was the last of the great Roman conquerors. Unlike the cautious Augustus or the consolidating Hadrian who would follow him, Trajan believed that the best way to secure the empire was through aggressive forward defense. He looked at the troublesome kingdom of Dacia across the Danube River in modern-day Romania, which had been a thorn in Rome's side for decades, and he decided to solve the problem permanently. He launched two massive military campaigns, and after years of hard fighting, he conquered Dacia completely, annexing it as a new Roman province. The spoils from the Dacian gold mines were immense, and they funded Trajan's other great passion, building. He used the newfound wealth to transform the city of Rome. His most famous project was a massive new forum complex, Trajan's Forum, which was the largest and most magnificent of all the imperial forums. It included a grand public square, two libraries, and a massive basilica. At its center stood the most famous monument of his reign, Trajan's Column. This colossal, 126-foot-tall marble column was decorated with a continuous, spiraling frieze that depicted the entire story of the Dacian Wars in vivid detail, a permanent stone comic strip celebrating his greatest military victory.
The story told on Trajan's Column is a masterpiece of Roman propaganda and a testament to the might of the legionary machine. In over 150 different scenes, the frieze shows the Roman army on campaign. We see soldiers building forts and bridges. We see them marching in perfect formation. We see them engaged in brutal combat with the Dacian warriors. We see Trajan himself constantly directing the troops, performing religious sacrifices, and accepting the surrender of enemy chieftains. It is a story of order, discipline, and inevitable victory. This column and the vast forum complex it stood in was a powerful statement. It was a celebration of Trajan as the perfect Roman leader, the Optimus Princeps, the best ruler, a title officially bestowed upon him by the Senate. He was seen as a man who brought both military glory and domestic prosperity to the empire. He oversaw a massive social welfare program known as the Alimenta, which used state funds to support poor children in Italy. He was a ruler who was genuinely popular with both the common people and the aristocracy. Late in his reign, the aging emperor embarked on one last ambitious military campaign, this time against the Parthian Empire in the east. He was initially successful, capturing the Parthian capital and marching all the way to the Persian Gulf. He had expanded the Roman Empire to its absolute maximum extent. But the newly conquered territories proved difficult to hold. Revolts broke out behind him, and his health began to fail. On his journey back to Rome, Trajan suffered a stroke and died in 117 AD. He had been a model emperor, a man who represented the pinnacle of Roman power and confidence. He left behind an empire at its territorial peak, and he had already chosen his successor, another talented Spanish general, his cousin and ward, Hadrian.
The man who succeeded Trajan, Publius Aelius Hadrianus, or Hadrian, was a completely different kind of emperor. While Trajan was an expansionist, a man who believed in pushing Rome's borders ever outwards, Hadrian was a consolidator. He was one of the most intelligent, complex, and well-traveled men to ever hold the imperial throne. He was a true intellectual, a lover of Greek culture, an accomplished poet, and a passionate amateur architect. And his first major decision as emperor was to reverse his predecessor's greatest achievement.
Hadrian immediately abandoned Trajan's newly conquered eastern provinces. He recognized that they were overextended and impossible to defend. He pulled the legions back to more stable, established frontiers. This was a radical and, for some, controversial policy. It signaled a fundamental shift in Roman grand strategy, from endless expansion to permanent consolidation and defense. Hadrian's goal was not to conquer new lands, but to secure the ones Rome already had. And to do this, he knew he had to see them for himself. This decision inaugurated the great theme of Hadrian's reign: travel. More than any other emperor, Hadrian spent the majority of his time not in Rome, but touring the vast provinces of his empire. He spent more than half of his 21-year reign on the road. He visited Gaul, Germania, Spain, Africa, the eastern provinces, and Egypt. He wanted to see every corner of his domain, to inspect the legions, to resolve local disputes, and to ensure the frontiers were secure. His journeys were not just symbolic. They were a massive administrative undertaking that gave him an unparalleled understanding of the empire he ruled. And wherever he went, he built.
Hadrian's reign was defined by his obsession with building, particularly fortifications. His travels were not just tours, they were massive construction projects. His most famous legacy is in the remote northern part of Roman Britain. There, he commanded the construction of Hadrian's Wall, a 73-mile-long stone fortification that stretched from coast to coast, marking the northernmost frontier of the Roman Empire. It was not just a wall, it was a complex system of forts, mile castles, and watchtowers, a permanent and intimidating statement of Roman power and its limits. He built similar fortified lines, or limes, along the Rhine and Danube frontiers in Germania. His building projects were not just military. He founded new cities throughout the empire, and he lavished attention on his beloved province of Greece, particularly Athens, where he completed the massive temple of Olympian Zeus that had been started centuries before. In Rome itself, his most enduring architectural masterpiece is the Pantheon. While the original building was constructed by Agrippa, it had been damaged by fire. Hadrian rebuilt it completely, and the famous, breathtaking coffered dome, still the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world, is a product of his architectural genius. But perhaps the most personal and revealing of his projects was his sprawling private villa at Tivoli outside Rome. This was not a single palace, but a vast complex of over 30 buildings spread across hundreds of acres. It was a kind of architectural scrapbook of his travels. He built replicas of the places he had admired on his journeys: a canal named after the Egyptian city of Canopus, a Greek-style theater, libraries, and temples. It was a private dream world, a miniature empire built for a restless, intellectual, and endlessly curious emperor.
Hadrian was a man of complex and often contradictory passions. His deep love for Greek culture earned him the nickname Graiculus, or the Little Greek. He was a scholar and an artist, but he was also a disciplined military commander and a ruthless administrator. His personal life was also the subject of much attention. He had a notoriously poor relationship with his wife, Sabina, and their marriage was childless. His greatest and most famous love was for a young Greek man from Bithynia named Antinous. Antinous was a beautiful youth who became Hadrian's constant companion on his travels throughout the empire. The exact nature of their relationship is debated, but it was clearly one of deep affection. The tragedy of Hadrian's life occurred in 130 AD, when the young Antinous drowned under mysterious circumstances in the Nile River while they were touring Egypt. Hadrian was consumed by a grief that was considered by many Romans to be excessive and undignified. His reaction was extraordinary. he deified Antinous, declaring him a god. He founded a new city, Antinopolis, on the banks of the Nile where his beloved had died. He encouraged a religious cult to spring up around the new god, and statues of the beautiful Antinous, depicted as various gods like Osiris or Dionysus, were erected all across the empire. More statues of Antinous have survived from antiquity than of any other Roman figure except Augustus and Hadrian himself. In his final years, the aging Hadrian, now in poor health, became more suspicious and reclusive. Like Augustus, he had no son, so he carefully chose his successor, adopting a respected senator named Antoninus on the condition that Antoninus would, in turn, adopt two young men to succeed him, the young Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus.
When Hadrian died in 138 AD, his chosen successor, Antoninus, became emperor. The Senate initially disliked Hadrian and wanted to condemn his memory, but Antoninus, in his first act as emperor, dutifully insisted that his adoptive father be deified. This act of loyalty and piety earned him the honorific name he is known by, Pius, and the reign of Antoninus Pius is remarkable for being the most peaceful, the most stable, and, in a way, the most uneventful in all of Roman history. For 23 years, from 138 to 161 AD, almost nothing happened, and that was a very good thing. Antoninus Pius was the polar opposite of his predecessor. While Hadrian was a restless traveler, Antoninus never once left Italy during his entire reign. He governed the empire from the comfort of his palace in Rome. While Hadrian had been a complex and often difficult personality, Antoninus was known for his gentle demeanor, his clemency, and his simple, frugal lifestyle. He was, by all accounts, a thoroughly decent and well-liked man. His reign represents the absolute zenith of the Pax Romana. There were no major wars, no major rebellions. There were a few minor troubles on the frontiers in Britain and Mauritania, but these were handled by his generals. He was a skilled administrator who managed the empire's finances so well that he left behind a massive surplus in the treasury. He was not an innovator or a great builder like his predecessors. His goal was simply to maintain the peace and prosperity that he had inherited. His reign is often overlooked by historians, precisely because it was so quiet. It was a long, calm, golden afternoon for the Roman Empire, a period of serene stability before the storm that was to follow. He died peacefully in his bed, passing the empire smoothly to his two adopted sons, just as Hadrian had arranged. The succession of Marcus Aurelius and his adoptive brother Lucius Verus marked the first time the empire was ruled by two co-emperors with equal power. But it is Marcus Aurelius who has captured the imagination of history. He was the man whom Hadrian had spotted as a promising youth, the man who had been trained for the throne for decades, and he was in every sense a philosopher. He was a devoted student of Stoicism, a school of Greek philosophy that taught self-control, duty, and acceptance of one's fate. The great dream of Plato that one day philosophers would be kings seemed to have finally come true. But the universe, with a sense of profound and cruel irony, had decided to test this philosopher-king with a series of unrelenting crises. His reign was anything but the peaceful, contemplative life he craved. It was a reign of constant warfare, plague, and personal tragedy. The peaceful afternoon of Antoninus Pius's reign had given way to a violent and stormy twilight. Almost immediately, the Parthian Empire invaded Rome's eastern provinces, forcing his co-emperor Lucius Verus to lead a long and difficult campaign. The Romans were eventually victorious, but the returning soldiers brought back something far more deadly than Parthian gold: a devastating plague. This plague, known as the Antonine Plague, likely a form of smallpox, swept through the entire empire for over a decade. It killed millions of people, perhaps as much as a quarter of the entire population in some areas. It devastated the economy, hollowed out the legions, and created a mood of fear and despair. And while this was happening, a new and far more serious threat was emerging on the northern frontier. A vast confederation of Germanic tribes, led by the Marcomanni and the Quadi, crossed the Danube River and invaded Italy itself, threatening the very heart of the empire. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher who wrote about inner peace and tranquility, would be forced to spend the rest of his life as a warrior.
For the last 14 years of his reign, Marcus Aurelius was not in his library in Rome, but in a cold, damp military camp on the banks of the Danube River, leading his legions in a series of brutal, grinding, and largely defensive wars against the Germanic tribes. This was the great paradox of his life. He was a man who preached about logic and self-control, yet he was surrounded by the chaos and savagery of war. He was a man who valued peace above all else, yet he became one of Rome's most dedicated warrior emperors. And it was here, in the midst of his campaigns, sitting in his tent at night after a long day of fighting, that he wrote his famous book, The Meditations. The book was not intended for publication. It was his own private journal, a series of personal notes and philosophical exercises written in Greek, designed to help himself apply the principles of Stoicism to the immense pressures he faced. It is one of the most remarkable documents to survive from the ancient world, a direct window into the mind of a man trying to be good and just while ruling a world that was falling apart. He writes about duty, about accepting his fate, about finding tranquility in the face of pain and death. The universe is change. Our life is what our thoughts make it, he reminds himself. He reflects on the insignificance of his own life in the grand sweep of cosmic time. Soon you will have forgotten all things, and all things will have forgotten you. These are the private thoughts of a man struggling to maintain his own humanity and sanity in the most difficult of circumstances. He eventually pushed the Germanic tribes back across the Danube, but the wars were endless. In 180 AD, while still on campaign near modern-day Vienna, the philosopher king contracted the plague and died, leaving the empire to his only surviving son, Commodus.
With the death of Marcus Aurelius, the golden age of the 5 good emperors came to a crashing, spectacular, and deeply embarrassing end. Marcus, the great Stoic philosopher, made one fatal, unphilosophical mistake. He allowed his own flesh and blood, his deeply flawed son Commodus, to succeed him. He broke the chain of adoptive succession that had given the empire a century of stability, and in doing so, he plunged it back into chaos. Commodus was the antithesis of his father in every way. Where Marcus was dutiful and self-controlled, Commodus was vain, lazy, and utterly self-indulgent. He had no interest in the tedious business of governing. He quickly made peace with the Germanic tribes, abandoning his father's hard-won victories, and rushed back to Rome to enjoy the pleasures of the palace. His reign was a disaster. He left the administration of the empire to a series of corrupt favorites, while he devoted himself to his own hedonistic pursuits. But his greatest obsession was with the gladiatorial arena. He was convinced that he was the reincarnation of the demigod Hercules, and he began to style himself as such, often appearing in public clad in a lion's skin and carrying a club. His ultimate fantasy was to be a gladiator himself. This was a source of profound shame for the Roman elite. The emperor, the most dignified figure in the world, was debasing himself by fighting in the arena, a profession reserved for slaves and social outcasts. He would fight against terrified, undertrained opponents and exotic animals in staged combats, and demand to be paid an exorbitant fee from the gladiatorial fund for each appearance. His megalomania grew until he even renamed the city of Rome Colonia Commodina in his own honor. After 12 years of his embarrassing and tyrannical rule, his inner circle decided they had had enough. A conspiracy was formed, involving his own mistress, Marcia. They first tried to poison him, but when that failed,
they sent his personal wrestling partner, a professional athlete named Narcissus, into his bath to strangle him to death. The Golden Age was well and truly over.
The death of Commodus created a power vacuum, and the year 193 AD would prove to be even more chaotic than the infamous Year of the Four Emperors. It is known as the Year of the Five Emperors, and it began with a descent into farce. Commodus's successor, the respectable but elderly Pertinax, was murdered by the Praetorian Guard after just 3 months because he tried to instill discipline and cut their pay. And then, the Praetorians did something so brazen, so shamelessly corrupt, that it shocked the entire Roman world. They held an auction for the imperial throne. 2 wealthy senators, Flavius Sulpicianus and Didius Julianus, came to the gates of the Praetorian camp and began bidding for the empire, shouting their offers up to the guards on the ramparts. Didius Julianus won, offering a staggering 25,000 sesterces to every soldier. He had literally bought the Roman Empire. His reign was a joke. The Roman people openly mocked him, and more importantly, the powerful legions on the frontiers were disgusted. The armies in Britain, Syria, and on the Danube all proclaimed their own generals as emperor. A new, massive civil war erupted. The man who emerged victorious from this bloody free-for-all was the commander of the Danube legions, a ruthless, formidable general from the province of Africa named Lucius Septimus Severus. He marched on Rome, had the pathetic Didius Julianus executed, disbanded the corrupt Praetorian Guard, and established himself as the undisputed master of the empire. Severus was a new kind of emperor. He was a tough, provincial soldier with no connection to the old Roman aristocracy. He had no time for the Senate or the polite fictions of the Augustan Principate. He was a military autocrat, and he knew that the only thing that truly mattered was the loyalty of the army. He established a new, much larger Praetorian Guard, loyal only to himself. He dramatically increased the pay for all soldiers, and he made it clear that the emperor was now first and foremost a military monarch. His famous deathbed advice to his 2 sons, Caracalla and Geta, perfectly summarized his philosophy, and it would become the guiding principle for the century to come. Get along, enrich the soldiers, and despise everyone else.
The reign of Septimius Severus was one of constant campaigning and military reform. He was an energetic and effective ruler who stabilized the frontiers and solidified the new reality of the empire. It was a military dictatorship, plain and simple. He spent very little time in Rome, preferring to be with his armies on the frontiers in the east against the Parthians, or in Africa, or even in Britain, where he died in the city of York in 211 AD while campaigning against the Caledonian tribes. He left the empire jointly to his 2 sons, Caracalla and Geta, hoping they would rule together as he and Marcus Aurelius had, in a sense, done before him. This was a fatal miscalculation of their character. The 2 brothers hated each other with a passion. Their relationship had been one of bitter rivalry since childhood, and the prospect of them sharing power was a fantasy. They returned to Rome and effectively divided the imperial palace in 2, each living in constant fear of being assassinated by the other. The situation was untenable. After less than a year of this tense co-rule, Caracalla decided to solve the problem. He lured his brother Geta into their mother's chambers under the pretense of a reconciliation. As Geta embraced their mother, Caracalla had his centurions rush in and cut him down in her arms. Caracalla was now the sole ruler, and his reign was defined by his brutality and his obsession with the army. He was a deeply unpleasant man, nicknamed Caracalla after a type of Gallic hooded cloak that he made fashionable. He spent most of his reign with the legions, trying to emulate Alexander the Great, but possessing none of his genius, only his ambition. He was a cruel and paranoid tyrant who murdered thousands of suspected enemies. But his reign is remembered for one of the most significant legal acts in all of Roman history, an edict he passed for purely cynical reasons.
In the year 212 AD, Caracalla issued an edict known as the Constitutio Antoniniana.
This decree granted full Roman citizenship to every free inhabitant of the Roman Empire. On the surface, it was the culmination of centuries of Roman expansion and integration, a grand gesture of universal inclusion. Millions of people in the provinces, from Britain to Syria, who had lived as Roman subjects, were now, overnight, Roman citizens with all the legal rights and protections that entailed. It was a landmark moment that fundamentally changed the nature of the empire. However, Caracalla's motives were not born from a noble universalist vision. They were, as always, rooted in greed and military necessity. There were two main reasons for the edict. First, only Roman citizens were required to pay certain inheritance and manumission taxes. By making everyone a citizen, Caracalla dramatically increased the state's tax base, bringing in a huge new source of revenue which he could use to fund the massive pay raises and bonuses he had promised the army. Second, it expanded the pool of men eligible to serve in the legions, as only citizens could be legionaries. It was a cynical move, a way to get more money and more soldiers. Despite its cynical origins, the Edict of Caracalla was a profoundly transformative act. It broke down the legal distinction between the ruling Italians and the subject provincials, accelerating the process of creating a single, shared Roman identity across the Mediterranean world. Caracalla himself did not live long to see its effects. His brutal and erratic behavior made him enemies everywhere. In 217 AD, while on campaign in the east, he was assassinated by a disgruntled soldier, an act secretly orchestrated by his praetorian prefect, Macrinus, who then promptly declared himself emperor.
The death of Caracalla marked the beginning of one of the most bizarre chapters in Roman imperial history. The new emperor, Macrinus, was a competent administrator, but he made a fatal mistake. He tried to cut the army's pay. At the same time, the formidable sister of Caracalla's mother, Julia Maesa, who had been exiled to Syria, began to plot against him. She had 2 grandsons, and she was determined to see the Severan dynasty restored. Her chosen candidate was her eldest grandson, a 14-year-old boy named Varius Avitus Bassianus, who happened to be the hereditary high priest of the sun god Elagabalus in the city of Emesa. Julia Maesa cleverly spread a rumor among the local legions that the boy was, in fact, the illegitimate son of the beloved Caracalla. The soldiers, already unhappy with Macrinus, mutinied and declared the teenaged priest their emperor. Macrinus was defeated in battle and executed. And so, in 218 AD, the 14-year-old high priest, now known by the name of his god, Elagabal, arrived in Rome to rule the empire, and Rome had never seen anything like him. Elagabalus was not interested in Roman traditions or the business of governing. He was interested only in his strange, ecstatic Eastern religion. He replaced Jupiter at the head of the Roman pantheon with his sun god Elagabal. He built a grand temple to his god on the Palatine Hill and forced the most senior senators to participate in his bizarre religious rites, which involved dancing and chanting around a conical black stone, the symbol of the deity. Beyond his religious fervor, his personal conduct also deeply shocked the Roman establishment. The ancient sources, though hostile, describe a lifestyle that defied all Roman conventions of public and private dignity. His complete disregard for the traditions of a Roman leader profoundly alienated the conservative elite. After 4 years of his increasingly erratic and embarrassing reign, his own grandmother, Julia Maesa, who had put him on the throne, realized he was a liability. She arranged for him to be assassinated by the Praetorian Guard. The throne then passed to her other, more sensible grandson, the young Alexander Severus.
The reign of Alexander Severus was a brief, calm interlude after the chaos of Elagabalus. He was a gentle and well-meaning young man, guided by his mother and a council of respected senators. He tried to restore the prestige of the Senate
and govern in a more traditional, moderate style. But the empire was facing increasing threats on its frontiers, from both the new Sasanian Empire in the east and the Germanic tribes in the north. Alexander was not a military man, and the army began to lose respect for him. In 235 AD, while on campaign in Germania, he tried to negotiate with the German tribes and pay them off rather than fight. This was seen as a sign of weakness by his soldiers. His own legions mutinied and murdered him and his mother in their tent. The murder of Alexander Severus marks the official beginning of the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year period of almost complete anarchy, civil war, plague, and economic collapse. The man the soldiers chose to replace Alexander was the man who had led the mutiny against him, Gaius Julius Verus Maximinus, better known as Maximinus Thrax. He was the first of the so-called barracks emperors. He was, according to the sources, a Thracian peasant of immense physical size and strength, a common soldier who had risen through the ranks purely on military merit. He was the complete opposite of the cultured Alexander. He was a brutal, unsophisticated soldier who reportedly hated the aristocracy and had never even set foot in the city of Rome. His reign was short and violent. He spent all his time on the frontiers fighting, and he imposed crushing taxes on the senatorial class to pay for his wars. After just 3 years, the Senate and then the rest of the empire rose up in revolt against his tyranny. In 238 AD, while on campaign in Germania, he tried to march on Rome to crush the rebellion. Maximinus Thrax was murdered by his own disillusioned soldiers, the very men who had made him emperor. His death set the pattern for the next 50 years. The empire would now be ruled by whoever had the strongest army, and for only as long as they could keep them happy.
The 50 years following the death of Maximinus Thrax are a dizzying, chaotic blur of emperors, usurpers, and civil wars. It is almost impossible to keep track of the names, and perhaps it is better not to try. The story of this period is not the story of individuals, but of a system in total collapse. Emperors would be proclaimed by their legions on the frontier, rule for a year or two, and then be murdered by their own troops, who would then proclaim a new general. The average reign of an emperor during this period was just a couple of years. The empire was tearing itself apart from within. While the Romans were busy fighting each other, their external enemies took advantage of the chaos. The Germanic tribes in the north and the powerful Sasanian Persian Empire in the east launched devastating invasions into Roman territory. The most humiliating moment for Rome came in 260 AD. The Emperor Valerian was leading an army against the Persian king Shapur I near the city of Edessa. The Roman army was defeated, and Valerian himself was taken prisoner. This was a catastrophe of unprecedented scale. A Roman emperor, the sacred ruler of the world, was now a captive of a foreign king. The Persian sources claim that Shapur used the captured emperor as a human footstool, forcing Valerian to kneel every time the king mounted his horse. After Valerian died in captivity, Shapur is said to have had his skin flayed, stuffed with straw, and put on display in a Persian temple as a permanent testament to his victory. While likely an exaggeration, the story reflects the profound shock and humiliation that rippled across the Roman world. The empire seemed to be on the verge of total disintegration.
In the chaos following Valerian's capture, the Roman Empire literally broke apart. With the central government unable to defend the frontiers, the provinces began to take matters into their own hands. In the west, the provinces of Gaul, Britain, and Spain broke away to form their own independent state, now known as the Gallic Empire. It lasted for about 15 years and had its own series of emperors, its own senate, and its own army. They did not see themselves as rebels.
They saw themselves as preserving Roman civilization in Gaul at a time when Rome itself was incapable of doing so. In the east, an even more spectacular breakaway state emerged. The city of Palmyra, a wealthy caravan city in the Syrian desert, had long been a powerful Roman ally. In the power vacuum, its ambitious and brilliant queen, Zenobia, seized control of not just Syria, but also Egypt, the breadbasket of the empire, and much of Asia Minor. For a brief time, Zenobia ruled a vast and wealthy Palmyrian empire, styling herself as a new Cleopatra. So by the early 270s, the Roman Empire was fractured into three warring parts: the Gallic Empire in the west, the Palmyrian Empire in the east, and the legitimate but weak Roman government controlling Italy and Africa in the center. It seemed as though the empire of Augustus was gone for good, destined to shatter into a collection of successor states. It would take a series of tough, determined soldier emperors to pull it back from the brink, culminating in the reign of one of the empire's great unsung heroes.
The man who would stitch the Roman world back together was another Illyrian soldier of humble birth named Lucius Domitius Aurelianus. Aurelian became emperor in 270 AD, inheriting a fragmented and broken empire. He was a man of boundless energy and military genius, and in a short whirlwind reign of just 5 years, he managed to achieve the impossible. First, he abandoned the province of Dacia, the land conquered by Trajan, recognizing that it was an indefensible salient. Then he turned his attention to the great breakaway empires. He marched his legions east, and in a brilliant military campaign, he defeated the armies of Queen Zenobia and reconquered the entire Palmyrian Empire. He captured Zenobia herself and brought her back to Rome to be paraded in his triumph, though he spared her life and allowed her to retire to a comfortable villa. Next, he turned west. He marched his legions into Gaul and defeated the armies of the Gallic Empire, bringing Gaul, Britain, and Spain back into the Roman fold. In less than 5 years, he had completely restored the unity of the empire. For this incredible achievement, the Senate gave him the title he deserved, Restitutor Orbis, the restorer of the world. He also built a massive new set of defensive walls around the city of Rome, the Aurelian Walls, a powerful and permanent admission that the heart of the empire was no longer safe from barbarian attack. But like so many emperors of this chaotic century, Aurelian's success did not guarantee his safety. In 275 AD, while preparing for a campaign against Persia, he was assassinated by his own officers, the victim of a petty conspiracy based on a forged document. The restorer of the world was dead, and the crisis, though temporarily abated, was not yet over.
After several more short-lived emperors, power was finally seized in 284 AD by a man who understood that the old system was fundamentally broken and could not be repaired. This was Diocletian, another brilliant Illyrian general. He realized that the empire was simply too large and too complex for one man to rule alone, and that the constant problem of succession was the root cause of the civil wars. His solution was radical and revolutionary. He decided to divide the power. He created a system that we now call the tetrarchy, or the rule of four. Diocletian first appointed a co-emperor, a fellow general named Maximian, giving him the rank of Augustus and responsibility for the western half of the empire, while Diocletian ruled the east. Then he went a step further. He had each of the two Augusti adopt a junior emperor, a successor, known by the title of Caesar. The two Caesars would assist the Augusti in governing and would be their designated heirs, ready to take over when the senior emperors retired. It was a brilliant solution, creating a four-man imperial college that could manage the vast empire and, in theory, provide for a peaceful, orderly succession. But Diocletian's reforms went deeper.
He completely abandoned the old Augustan pretense of being the first citizen. He was an emperor, and he would be treated as such. He established a new form of rule known as the dominant. The emperor was now an absolute monarch, a remote, godlike figure. He wore jeweled robes and a golden diadem, and he demanded that those who came into his presence prostrate themselves on the ground. He created a vast new bureaucracy and reorganized the provinces. It was, in effect, the end of the classical Roman Empire and the beginning of the late antique, almost medieval world. After 20 years of his transformative rule, Diocletian did something no emperor had ever done before. In 305 AD, he voluntarily retired to his magnificent palace on the Dalmatian coast to grow cabbages, forcing his co-emperor Maximian to do the same.
Diocletian's elegant system of the tetrarchy, designed to prevent civil war, collapsed into civil war almost immediately after he retired. The sons of the original emperors and Caesars felt they had a hereditary right to rule, and a new, complex series of conflicts erupted. It was out of this chaos that the next great transformative figure of Roman history would emerge, Constantine the Great. Constantine was the son of one of the original Caesars, Constantius. When his father died while on campaign in Britain in 306 AD, his troops proclaimed him emperor, defying the rules of the tetrarchy. This set off a chain reaction of wars that would last for nearly 2 decades. Constantine was a brilliant general and a ruthless politician. One by one, he defeated his rivals. The most famous and pivotal moment of his rise to power came in 312 AD at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge just outside Rome. He was facing his rival Maxentius. According to the Christian historian Eusebius, on the eve of the battle, Constantine looked up at the sun and saw a cross of light above it, and with it the Greek words "en tuto nika," in this sign, conquer. That night he had a dream in which Christ appeared to him and told him to use the sign of the cross as his standard. Constantine ordered his soldiers to paint the Chi Rho symbol, a monogram of Christ's name, on their shields. The next day he won a decisive victory. Maxentius was killed, and Constantine entered Rome as the undisputed ruler of the West. Whether he truly had a vision, or whether it was a brilliant piece of political opportunism to win the support of the growing Christian minority, we will never know. But the event was transformative. Constantine, the Roman emperor, now believed he fought under the protection of the Christian God.
Constantine would spend the next decade consolidating his power, eventually defeating his last rival, Licinius, to become the sole ruler of the entire Roman Empire in 324 AD. His long reign would be defined by 2 monumental, world-changing decisions. The first was his continued embrace of Christianity. The Edict of Milan in 313 AD officially ended all persecution and granted religious tolerance throughout the empire. Constantine became a great patron of the church, funding the construction of magnificent basilicas in Rome and Jerusalem. He even presided over the first great ecumenical council, the Council of Nicaea, to settle matters of Christian doctrine. While he himself was only formally baptized on his deathbed, his patronage ensured that Christianity would go from a persecuted minority sect to the dominant religion of the Western world. His second monumental decision was to create a new capital for the empire. He recognized that the strategic and economic heart of the empire had shifted eastward. He chose the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, strategically located on the Bosporus Strait, and rebuilt it on a grand imperial scale. He filled it with churches, palaces, and a new Senate house. In 330 AD, he officially dedicated it as Nova Roma, New Rome, but everyone soon came to call it by his own name, Constantinople. This act was profoundly significant. It was a physical shift in the empire's center of gravity away from the old pagan city of Rome towards a new Christian capital in the east. It laid the foundation for what would become the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire that would survive for another 1,000 years after the West had fallen. When Constantine died in 337 AD, he left behind a Roman world that was fundamentally and irrevocably different from the one he had been born into.
After the death of Constantine, the empire was, for the most part, permanently divided between his successors into a western and an eastern half, each with its own emperor. The Eastern Empire, centered on the magnificent and well-defended city of Constantinople, would thrive and endure for another millennium. But our story now follows the tragic, slow decline of the Western Roman Empire, a long, century-long sunset. The emperors in the West became increasingly weak, isolated, and irrelevant. The real power was held not by the emperors hiding in their palaces in Ravenna or Milan, but by their powerful, often barbarian generals, the magistri militum. Figures like the Vandal general Stilicho or the Gothic general Ricimer were the true masters of the West. They were the kingmakers who would install and depose a series of weak, ineffectual puppet emperors. The Western Empire was slowly being hollowed out from within and battered from without. The frontiers, which had been so secure under Hadrian, were now porous. Entire Germanic tribes, fleeing the pressure of the Huns in the east, crossed the Rhine and Danube rivers and began to settle within the empire's borders. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded the city of Rome for 800 years was shattered. In 410 AD, the Visigoths, under their king Alaric, sacked the city, looting it for 3 days. In 455 AD, the Vandals sacked it again, even more thoroughly. The Western Roman Empire was now little more than Italy and a few scattered, beleaguered provinces. It was a hollowed-out shell waiting for a final, merciful push. That push would come not in a great battle, but in a quiet, almost bureaucratic administrative change.
The long and often bloody procession of Roman emperors comes to an end not with a bang, but with a quiet, almost comical whimper. The year is 476 AD. The last Roman emperor in the West is a young boy, a teenager of about 16. His name is Romulus, and his father, a Roman general named Orestes, had given him the grand honorific of Augustus. And so, by a strange quirk of fate, the very last emperor of Rome bore the names of both its mythical founder and its first great emperor, Romulus Augustulus, or Little Augustus. He was a powerless figurehead, a puppet of his father, but by this time, the Roman army in Italy was composed almost entirely of barbarian mercenaries. Their leader, a German chieftain named Odoacer, demanded that he and his men be given a third of the land in Italy. When Orestes refused, Odoacer's men mutinied, captured Orestes, and executed him. Odoacer then marched to the imperial capital of Ravenna. He entered the palace and faced the boy emperor, Romulus Augustulus. There was no great battle, no last stand. Odoacer simply deposed him. He saw that the title of Western Roman Emperor was now a hollow and meaningless fiction. Instead of killing the boy, he took pity on him, gave him a generous pension, and sent him into a comfortable retirement in a villa near Naples. Odoacer then sent the imperial insignia, the diadem, the purple robes, to the emperor in Constantinople with the message saying that the West no longer required an emperor of its own. And just like that, with a quiet abdication and a forced retirement, the Western Roman Empire was over. The long, strange, and often terrible story that began with Augustus
had finally, peacefully run its course.